She wasn't supposed to be there. At least, that's what everyone made her feel. A scholarship girl, the only black face in a sea of privilege, sitting in a Harvard lecture hall where every eye whispered doubt. For weeks, she stayed quiet, watching, listening, shrinking into the shadows as the brightest minds competed to shine. But then something happened. Something that silenced even Harvard's finest. The students everyone believed were untouchable, gave up. And in that silence, a hand rose, hesitant, trembling, but unshakably brave. It was hers. What happened in that moment was more than a question in class. It was a challenge to a system. A reminder that intelligence is not bound by skin color, wealth, or legacy. But the cost of raising that hand? It would follow her far beyond those walls. So, what made the entire room stop, and why does her story still matter today? She had always lived between two worlds. At home, in a modest neighborhood far from Harvard's red brick halls, life was about survival, stretching every dollar, helping her mother keep the lights on, and reminding her younger siblings that dreams were worth holding on to. At school, she stepped into a place built for privilege, where last names carried weight and opportunity flowed as naturally as breathing. She was the exception. A scholarship girl. A young black woman in a world that rarely expected her to belong. Every morning, she pressed her clothes until they looked perfect, walked with her head high, and carried the quiet hope that hard work would speak louder than prejudice. She filled her notebooks with meticulous notes, sat in the back rows, and rarely spoke. Not because she lacked the answers, but because she knew the cost of standing out in a room that never saw her as equal. On the surface, she seemed invisible, just another student in the crowd. But beneath that silence was a mind sharper than most around her, a determination carved from years of proving she was enough. Still, something was building. A moment she could neither predict nor escape. Because soon, the world she had worked so hard to quietly fit into, would be forced to see her. At first, it seemed like just another class. The lecture hall buzzed with voices, papers shuffled, laptops clicked. The professor scribbled equations on the board, his back turned to the students. For most of them, this was routine, another day in a life paved with certainty and confidence. But for her, every day felt like a quiet test, a battle to prove she belonged. She sat near the middle, hands folded tightly in her lap. She knew the answer to the problem on the board. She had known it since the professor first posed the question. But when she looked around, she saw only hesitation. Eyes dropped. Students who once bragged about brilliance now shifted uncomfortably, searching their notes for something that wasn't there. And then, it happened. One by one, the brightest minds of Harvard gave up. Pens stopped moving. Whispered murmurs of, "I don't know," spread like wildfire. The silence was louder than any lecture. Her chest pounded. This was her moment. But raising her hand meant more than solving an equation. It meant drawing every eye. It meant challenging a room that wasn't built for her. For a long, trembling second, she hesitated. And then, slowly, carefully, her hand rose. The silence deepened. The professor paused, chalk hovering midair. Dozens of eyes turned, some with surprise, some with skepticism, some with a shadow of disdain. Her throat tightened, but she didn't lower her hand. The professor called on her. She spoke clearly, each word steady, the answer flowing with a confidence born not of privilege but of resilience. By the time she finished, the equation was no longer a puzzle, it was solved. For a moment, there was nothing. No applause, no recognition. Just silence. And then, a ripple. Some students shifted in their seats, their expressions unreadable. Others exchanged glances, whispers trailing behind her like smoke. That was the first spark. And sparks, in places full of hidden fuel, rarely stay small. The next days blurred into whispers she couldn't escape. In the cafeteria, heads tilted when she walked past. In study groups, her suggestions were brushed aside, until a louder voice repeated them minutes later and suddenly, they carried weight. She heard the subtle digs cloaked as jokes, Wow, you really surprised us with that answer. Didn't think you'd get it before we did. Every word stung, not because they doubted her intelligence, but because they couldn't see it without disbelief. It wasn't praise. It was shock. As if her success was unnatural. And yet, she kept working harder. She thought if she stayed quiet, kept proving herself, they would eventually accept her. But silence in the face of prejudice is never enough. The more she excelled, the louder the resistance grew. Her grades climbed. Her professors noticed her potential. But so did her classmates. And what began as whispers soon grew into walls. Invitations to study groups stopped coming. Partners for projects avoided her. When she walked into the library, whole tables seemed to close off before she reached them. One evening, she overheard them. A group of students, their laughter spilling out of the dorm lounge. She only got in because of the scholarship. Yeah, and you know what kind of scholarship. Exactly. Not merit. Diversity points. Her stomach dropped. She didn't need to hear more. She already knew what they meant. To them, she wasn't a Harvard student, she was a token, a symbol, a box checked. She went back to her dorm room, closed the door, and let the weight press down. For the first time, she wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong. But then she remembered her mother's words the day she left home, "You're not just going there for yourself. You're carrying all of us with you." And so, she pushed harder. The turning point came during a high-stakes seminar. The professor presented a complex case study, one that left the class divided. Students argued, voices clashing, egos sparking like fire against stone. For over an hour, no one could find a solution that satisfied the problem. She sat quietly, heart pounding. She saw the answer, the flaw no one else noticed. She waited for someone else to point it out, but no one did. Finally, she spoke. Calmly, precisely, she laid out her reasoning. The room fell silent as her argument unfolded, weaving through every counterpoint, dismantling every assumption. By the time she finished, even the professor was nodding. And that was when it began, not just whispers, not just jokes, but open resistance. The next morning, she found her notes scattered across the floor of the lecture hall. Someone had dumped them from her desk, pages torn and trampled. On her locker, words were scratched deep into the metal, "Go back where you came from." Her chest tightened, her breath short. She looked around, but no one met her eyes. No one admitted what they had done. It didn't stop there. In group assignments, her contributions were dismissed until others claimed them as their own. During class debates, interruptions drowned her out, voices overlapping until hers was erased. And when she did manage to speak, the looks, the rolling eyes, the smirks, the raised brows, cut deeper than words. Yet, she refused to disappear. Every time they tried to push her down, she rose higher. Every insult, every dismissal became fuel. But the higher she climbed, the more dangerous it became. Because Harvard wasn't just a place of learning, it was a mirror of the world outside. And the world outside wasn't ready to see her shine. The breaking point came late one night. She was walking back from the library, the campus quiet, shadows stretching across the old stone buildings. Her backpack felt heavy, her steps echoing against the cobblestones. That's when she heard it, footsteps behind her. Slow. Steady. Too deliberate to be random. Her chest tightened. She glanced back. 3 figures. Students. Their faces half hidden in the dim glow of the lamps. They laughed, low and sharp. One of them called out, "Hey, scholarship girl." Her pace quickened. Their footsteps did too. "You think you're smarter than us? You don't belong here." Her heart pounded, fear clawing up her throat. She clutched her bag, her mind racing. The library was too far. Her dorm felt unreachable. The footsteps closed in. Laughter echoed. And then, sudden silence. She turned. They were gone. Just shadows melting into the night. But the message was clear, she was not safe. Not here. Not anywhere. She reached her room, locked the door, and sat against it, trembling. For the first time, the thought struck her, what if they were right? What if no matter how much she proved herself, it would never be enough? But then, another thought followed. What if that was exactly why she had to keep going? And that question, unanswered, haunting, kept her awake until dawn. The weeks that followed blurred into exhaustion. She lived in a rhythm of resistance, smiling when she felt broken, studying when her eyes burned with fatigue, standing tall when every whisper told her she didn't belong. But the pressure was building, coiling tighter with each passing day. Something was going to break. It came during the biggest academic event of the semester, the Harvard Debate Symposium. Students from across departments gathered to compete. Professors filled the rows, alumni watched from the back, and reputations were made or destroyed in a single evening. For most, it was a chance to shine. For her, it was a battlefield. She hadn't even planned to speak. But when her name was called, the room shifted. Faces turned, smirks flickered, whispers carried through the air like static. They were waiting. Waiting for her to fail. Her chest tightened, her throat dry. She could walk away. She could let the moment pass, fade into the silence they expected from her. But something inside her hardened. She stepped forward. The moderator posed the question, complex, layered, designed to break apart even the sharpest thinkers. Voices before her stumbled, circled, contradicted themselves. And then it was her turn. She began slowly, carefully, her voice trembling at first. But with each word, strength returned. She dismantled flawed logic, connected evidence, and wove arguments with precision. Her voice rose, steady and commanding, filling every corner of the hall. For a few minutes, the whispers stopped. Even the smirks faded. Every eye was on her, not with pity, not with disbelief, but with a silence she had never known. A silence that came when truth could not be ignored. And then, interruption. A voice from the audience, sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. She's only confident because she memorized it. That's not intelligence, that's performance. Laughter followed. Low, cruel, deliberate. Her hands trembled. Her heart raced. She had expected resistance, but not here, not now. The moment she thought she had claimed was slipping away. She looked at the moderator, but no one silenced the interruption. No one defended her. Something inside her broke. Not into pieces, but into fire. She stepped closer to the podium, her voice cutting through the laughter. Calm, steady, unshaken. You think my presence here is a mistake. You think my success is charity. But the truth is simple, if you had worked half as hard as I have, you wouldn't need to tear me down to feel tall. Gasps rippled across the hall. Some faces froze in shock. Others hardened with anger. The moderator shifted uncomfortably. But she didn't stop. For years, I've listened to you dismiss me, mock me, erase me. You think brilliance belongs to you because of your name, your wealth, your skin. But brilliance doesn't care about that. Brilliance is earned. And tonight, I proved it. The room erupted, not with applause, not with cheers, but with chaos. Some clapped hesitantly. Others jeered, muttered, walked out. Professors whispered among themselves, some nodding, others frowning. And then came the breaking blow. The next morning, an anonymous post spread through the campus forum. A doctored photo of her, captions twisting her words, painting her as arrogant, ungrateful, undeserving. Comments piled up, cruel and venomous. She doesn't belong here. She's playing the race card. She should be grateful, not loud. By midday, her inbox overflowed with messages, some mocking, others threatening. In the cafeteria, conversations stopped when she entered. In class, students avoided her gaze, some openly sneering. The world she had tried to fit into was closing in, crushing her beneath its weight. She stopped eating in the dining hall. She stopped walking alone at night. She began to shrink again, retreating into silence. But silence no longer felt safe. One night, as she returned to her dorm, she found her door defaced. Words scrawled in thick, black ink, "You don't belong." Her knees weakened. She pressed her hand against the door, the ink staining her skin. Her chest heaved, tears blurring her vision. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It wasn't just mockery. It was war. She locked herself inside and sank to the floor, her body trembling. For hours, she sat in darkness, replaying every moment, every smile, every laugh, every cruel word. She wondered if maybe giving up would be easier. If walking away, disappearing, would finally silence the storm. But then, in the hollow quiet of that night, another memory surfaced. Her mother's voice, "When you raise your hand, you raise it for everyone who can't." And suddenly, she knew. The climax wasn't the attack. The climax was the choice. She could remain silent, let them erase her, surrender to their hate. Or she could rise. The next morning, she made her choice. She walked into class, her head high, the ink-stained words still faint on her hand. The professor asked a question. No one answered. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hand. And in that moment, the world stopped. The choice had been made. The cost would be heavy. But the impact? The impact would echo far beyond Harvard's walls. When she raised her hand again, it wasn't just about answering a question. It wasn't even about proving her brilliance anymore. It was about reclaiming her place in a world that had tried to erase her. That single motion, small, simple, almost ordinary, was the loudest act of defiance she had ever made. The professor called on her. Her voice carried steady through the hall, each word deliberate, unshaken by the eyes that followed her. She explained her reasoning, dismantled the problem with precision, and by the end, there was no doubt left in the room. Not about the answer, and not about her. But victory didn't come with applause. It rarely does. The silence afterward was heavy, filled with everything left unsaid, respect from some, resentment from others, discomfort from many. It was the kind of silence that doesn't vanish quickly, the kind that lingers like smoke after a fire. And yet, within that silence, something shifted. Not in everyone. Prejudice does not vanish overnight. But in a few, just enough, eyes softened, minds opened, perspectives cracked. A handful of students approached her quietly afterward, voices low, admitting they had underestimated her. Others didn't speak, but the look in their eyes betrayed something they could no longer deny: she belonged. That night, she returned to her dorm and sat at her desk, staring at her ink-stained hand. The words they had written on her door were still there in her mind: "You don't belong." But for the first time, she didn't hear them as truth. She heard them as a lie. A lie repeated so often that the world had mistaken it for reality. And she realized, fighting lies wasn't just survival. It was responsibility. Because what had happened to her wasn't unique. It wasn't only her story. It was the story of countless students, workers, neighbors, and strangers who carried the same weight of doubt pressed against their skin. It was the story of anyone who had ever been told they were an exception, a token, an outsider in a place they had earned. Her struggle at Harvard was a mirror, a reflection of a much larger truth. That racism is not only found in slurs or violence, but also in whispers, in dismissals, in the heavy silence of rooms that pretend to be equal but are not. In the weeks that followed, she no longer shrank into the background. She spoke more. She raised her hand more. And every time she did, it became harder for the world around her to look away. Professors began to recognize her sharpness not as surprise but as expectation. Students who once ignored her started to listen, some reluctantly, some sincerely. But the wounds remained. She still felt the sting of the whispers, the isolation, the fear that trailed her walks at night. Healing would not be quick. It never is. Still, she carried herself differently now. Not lighter, because the weight was still there, but stronger, because she knew what it meant to lift it and keep walking anyway. Years later, she would look back at that moment, the raised hand in the silent hall, as the turning point. Not because it erased the injustice, but because it reminded her, and everyone watching, that silence is never the answer. And so, her story lingers. Because it is not only about a girl at Harvard. It is about every space where privilege decides who is seen and who is silenced. It is about every system that applauds equality in theory but resists it in practice. It is about the resilience it takes to be more than what the world expects, to keep raising your hand even when it trembles. Her story forces us to ask, how many voices are still unheard, how many hands remain unraised, because the weight of prejudice keeps them down? And more importantly, how many more will it take before we finally listen? The truth is, she should never have had to fight that hard just to be seen as equal. None of them should. But she did. And by doing so, she lit a spark that cannot be easily extinguished. Because courage spreads. Bravery multiplies. One raised hand becomes another, and then another, until silence is no longer possible. The cost of racism is not only borne by those who suffer it, it is borne by all of us. Every time a brilliant mind is silenced, every time a hand is forced down, the world loses what it might have gained. Knowledge. Innovation. Change. So, the question is no longer whether she belonged at Harvard. The question is, how many more must prove themselves over and over again before belonging is not something to be earned, but something that is given freely? She raised her hand, and changed everything. Not just for herself, but for everyone who would come after her. For every young black student walking into a room where their worth is doubted. For every person told they were a mistake, an exception, a token. Her hand still rises, even now. Not in that lecture hall, but in every retelling of her story, in every mind that carries it forward. And maybe, just maybe, it will rise in you too. Because the next time you see injustice, silence will not protect you. Silence will not change anything. But raising your hand, your voice, your truth, just might. So I'll leave you with this. How many more hands will remain in the shadows before we, together, choose to raise them all?